Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Emily Peters. I'm a forest ecologist at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. My co-author here is Lacey Levine, who's a forest policy analyst also at the DNR. And my goal with this talk is really just simply to give you an overview of Minnesota DNR's approach for managing old growth forests. It's more of the land manager perspective here than maybe some of the other talks that have happened so far. Old growth is a topic that the DNR has been working on for over 40 years. And I'm just going to describe some of the history, the current network of sites that we have and how we manage those lands, as well as some of the projects that we currently have underway. Okay, so generally, old growth forests, of course, have developed over a long period of time, essentially free from major stand replacing disturbances like wildfire and timber harvest. These are the late stages of succession. And of course, they're important for a lot of reasons. They provide unique habitats for plants and animals, store large amounts of carbon. They provide important recreational and cultural opportunities for people, among many other ecosystem services. Of course, not all old growth forests look like these that are on the screen here on this slide, especially not in Minnesota, but they do all tend to have relatively large, old, late successional tree species, decayed snags and logs on the forest floor, canopy gaps, and uneven age structure. So to get you oriented to Minnesota, this map on the left shows you where we're located. So along the northern United States border with Canada and right in the middle of the country. From an ecological perspective, it's a pretty cool place to be. It's the intersection of several major biomes. We've got prairie grasslands in the west and deciduous forest that runs diagonally across the middle of the state, and coniferous forest in the northeastern part. The photo over on the right of this slide gives you a sense of what some of our forests look like. This is an old growth northern hardwood forest. Some of the other old growth forest types that we have in Minnesota include lowland hardwoods like ash, upland red and white pine, and lowland conifers like black spruce and white cedar. So like in much of other parts of the world, old growth forests are a rare component of the landscape in Minnesota. And this figure here shows you the amount of old growth in Minnesota at different points in time. So starting in 1850, which is prior to European settlement, about half of Minnesota's forests were old. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Minnesota's economy was fueled by harvesting the oldest and largest trees to produce lumber for the growing nation. And today we have about 1 million acres of old forest, or about 6% of the total forest area across all ownerships in the state. It was in the 1980s that old growth really emerged as a contentious issue. And it was at this time that the timber industry was expanding in the state, and environmental groups were raising concerns about the need for old growth protections. This became a very controversial and polarized debate, as you can see from the quotes on the screen here, pitting forest industry against environmentalists. And eventually the DNR was sued. The result was that DNR agreed to work with a variety of stakeholders to develop an old growth forest policy for state lands. So this is not ideal policy development to initiate under a crisis like this, but this is how the old growth issue started in Minnesota. The DNR formed, in order to respond to this lawsuit settlement, we formed a task force and spent years working with stakeholders to develop an old growth policy. Often DNR's objective in these kind of contentious natural resource decision-making arenas is to reach what we call informed consent. So this is not trying to get everyone to all think that the policy agreement is great. It's instead informed consent is instead trying to get everybody to a place where they're willing to go along with the course of action, even if they don't fully agree with it. So you can see from the quotes here on the screen that I think DNR achieved that. and maybe a little bit better than that. And so by getting to informed consent with all the stakeholders that were involved in developing this old growth policy, it allowed DNR to move forward. And then we were able to identify our evaluation criteria in old growth sites. So this slide shows you what the old growth criteria are that we actually still have in place for our hardwood and pine forests. So these forests have trees that are at least 120 years old. They have high structural diversity with a mix of tree sizes and canopy gaps, presence of coarse woody debris on the forest floor. They also have relatively little evidence of human disturbance or severe natural disturbance. And our high quality examples are also part of larger blocks of forest that provide more resilience to stressors over time. So these stands themselves tend to be greater than 20 acres and are part of these larger forest complexes. Our current old growth network is about 48,000 acres in size. You can see those shown in red on the map to the right. But to put this in perspective, the Minnesota DNR manages a total of 5.6 million acres of land, of which 3.8 million acres of it are forest land. And we manage those 3.8 million acres of forest land for a lot of different purposes. We have a variety of underlying mandates associated with those lands. Some are managed for more economic objectives, like our school trust lands. Others are managed for more ecological protection, like our scientific and natural areas. And these 48,000 acres of designated old growth are spread across a variety of these different land types. So they're not all just on our scientific and natural areas, for example. The 48,000 acres of designated old growth, that does represent between 1 and 8%, depending on the forest type you're talking about, of DNR lands. We also have about 45,000 acres of what we call candidate old growth, and those are shown in blue on the map. These candidate sites, what that means is that these areas still need to be evaluated and a decision made about whether to actually designate and protect the site or whether to return it to our regular management pool. So most of this area in blue here is candidate lowland conifer old growth. And the reason for that is that we're in the middle of a very large project to identify and designate old growth in this particular forest type. It was not done back in the 90s, and we're kind of catching up on that now. So we've been working on it for the past 10 years. This is slow moving decision making, but we are hoping to have lowland conifer old growth designations in the next couple of years. Of course, all of you know forests change over time with natural disturbance and succession, and our old growth management policy allows for this network to be dynamic over time as well. So we do make a small amount of additions and removals every year, and this slide here shows you an overview of what that general process is for doing this. We have to create rules so that we're all following the same processes inside the department. So first, any DNR staff member can nominate a site for addition to the network. Following that nomination, an interdisciplinary team will review the nomination and decide whether to pursue a formal field evaluation or not. If yes, then that stand will get locked in our timber management data system to ensure that it's not accidentally put up for timber sale. And then that candidate site gets evaluated. The team makes a recommendation to leadership in terms of whether to officially designate the site or not. And then leadership gets to make that decision. Similarly, staff can nominate a site for removal from the network if there's been like a fire or a blowdown event, and it goes through a similar kind of review process and decision-making by leadership. So once a stand is designated as old growth and protected, then what's different, right, about how we manage these places? Overall, our main objective is to maintain and enhance the quality of that old growth forest over time. And this table here shows you what some of the high level management direction is for different kinds of activities. So Some things are not allowed, like timber harvest or new permanent road construction. But generally, activities that support natural processes and regeneration are allowed, like invasive species control, browse control, light on the land kind of methods as much as possible is what's called out in our management policy. Other activities are a little more nuanced, like new trail construction. So this is allowed if there's sort of sufficient educational benefits that go along with it. And then the last one I'll mention is just that land sale or exchange is something that's not prohibited by an old growth designation. And so there have been land sales and exchanges that have involved old growth on Minnesota state lands. I'll mention here that we are in the middle of revising our old growth forest policy. So this is something that's been long overdue. It's a decades old policy. There's a lot of areas in the policy where management activities are silent. And so staff have been asking lots of questions over the years about what they should do on in terms of certain activities. And so that's what we're working on, is kind of cleaning up the policy and addressing some of the questions that have emerged over the last couple of decades. Our management policy also has direction in terms of how to manage adjacent lands to the old growth sites, because of course the nature of the surrounding vegetation is really critical to the resilience of that old growth forest site. And so for this reason, we require a mandatory limited harvest buffer. We refer to around each of the old growth sites. We refer to those as special management zones. In the map, you can see these are the light blue areas around a dark blue old growth stand. These are primarily to minimize exposure to edge effects. We also have an optional old forest management complex, and that's additional areas surrounding old growth sites or connecting old growth sites, and you can see that in the yellow in the map. These are managed for older growth stage characteristics. Not all old growth sites have an old forest management complex, so there's a decision-making process associated with that. Truth be told, most of our old growth sites have been largely hands-off. They've been relatively passively managed over the last 20 to 30 years, and many of them haven't been visited in that amount of time. So a couple of years ago, we were issued a corrective action request by our certification auditors, SFI audits, for not having systematic monitoring in place for an old growth network. So over the last couple of years, we've been in the process of developing a monitoring approach. We have objectives you can see on the screen here to primarily assess the status of the network and also identify where we have site level management needs. We're still developing this. We're testing different methods. We're testing both remote sensing and field-based methods. It's really critical that whatever method we do end up utilizing is that it's practical and it's economical. We don't have a budget, a separate budget to do this work. So it ends up being yet another ask of our field foresters or field staff in general. But fortunately, we have a lot of support from within the department across several divisions to do this work. Yeah, at the bottom of the slide here, you can just see some of the preliminary results from our trial year where we visited 61 of these sites. I won't go through these details, these results in much detail, other than just saying the point is that we do have on the ground management needs in these sites, as well as some data governance maintenance work that's needed in order to keep this network up to date over time.
Hi, Emily. You're at your time.
Oh no, okay. All right. This will be my last point.
Okay.
We have public website that shows where these places are, but my main point here is just that this is a long-term endeavor. We have, just like the forests themselves, we have ongoing maintenance work and large projects underway, and so just doing one designation effort does not mean the end in terms of a land management perspective on old growth. Thanks, Trevor.
So hello everybody, my name is Clément Hardy. I'm a PhD student at the Université du Québec à Montréal, and today I'm going to present to you the results of the second chapter of my PhD thesis. There you go. So this is going to be a very classic presentation. I'll go through a quick intro, our methods, discussing our results, and a conclusion. But first of all, I propose that we take a quick tour of what uneven age management is. I know it was a pretty alien term for me when I started my thesis. So there are two broad ways of managing forests. We have even age management, in which we have cuts that tends to reset the stands. And so when it regrows, it has an homogeneous age structure. So this corresponds to methods like clear cutting or shelter wood cutting. And meanwhile, in uneven age management, the cuts are always partial, which keeps an heterogeneous age structure in the stands. And this corresponds to methods like selection cutting or irregular shelter wood. So even age management have always been the most commonly used option in North America, including Quebec. And meanwhile, uneven age management is more complex in its implementation and its effects, and it's not used a lot in mixed and boreal forests. So meanwhile, we have studies that have recently shown that uneven age management is better than even age management at capturing more carbon and retaining a diversity of birds, mammals, insects, plants, bryophytes, etc. However, these studies are always at the scale of a forest stand, and they look at things a few years after a cut. But forests operate at much larger and longer temporal scales, which begs the questions, what happens on the long term and on large scales when we use uneven age management? In particular, we know that uneven age management needs periodic entries into the stands, and it needs more surface harvested to get the same amount of wood than even age management. So we ask ourselves how these two aspects impacted the quantity of forest roads, the amount and the fragmentation of the old forests in landscapes. So we look at old forests because forest management does not really deforest the landscape, but as has been said today, it changes in its composition. So old growth forests are often much rarer in managed landscapes, but they are favored by many different species for their dispersal, reproduction, and forage. And they also provide key ecosystem services, which is why we focus on them here. So to answer these questions, we use the Landis-2 simulation model. So it's pretty well known in forest ecology. It's a model that simulates a forest landscapes that is affected by different disturbances or processes through time, represented by extensions that the user can choose. So we used an extension to simulate forest succession, forest fire, harvesting, and we also developed a new open source module to simulate forest roads. So it's quite unique in forest ecology today, as none seems to really exist before we made it. It's named the FRS module, and it's capable to use pathfinding algorithm and many shenanigans to make realistic forest road networks. So our study area is a management unit that is defined by the Ministry of Forests of Quebec. It has a surface of 800,000 hectares, and it's located in the Mauricie region of Quebec. And we simulated an additional 50-kilometer buffer zone that you can see in blue on this map around the area to avoid any border effects. But our results only concern the area that you see in the center. So we simulated this landscape for 150 years. And this study area is particular because it's composed of mixed forests in the south and boreal forest in the north. So as you will see, this is going to be important in our results later. So we made different simulation scenarios in which we varied the percentage of a biomass target that we had that was harvested with uneven age management, and the rest of this target was always harvested with even age management instead. So we also varied the aggregation of the harvested area across scenarios because it could impact the quantity of forest roads that was generated. And during the simulation, we measured the road density in the landscape and the costs of construction and repairs of the roads. And then we measured the amount and the fragmentation of old forests that we defined as forests with trees older than 91 years old. So to measure the fragmentation, we used the clumpy fragmentation index, which measured the aggregation of pixels of the same type. So now let's take a look at our results, but first I have to make a quick warning. We've run into a lot of bad luck before this presentation because we recently found out that because of bugs in a particular version of a Land2 model that I've been using, along with a mistake that I made, our simulation made fires that were too small, even if the burned area was okay, and we did not harvest enough wood in the area compared to the target to harvest. So I've done my best, but I couldn't prepare the new results before this presentation. The current results should still hold up. I wouldn't show them to you if they did not, but I will point out where things might change in the future. I apologize for the disturbance. So let's begin by taking a look at results related to roads. So all of the results displayed are going to be shown as the variation of our measures through the 150 years of simulations. Each curve corresponds to the average value among replicate scenarios, and each color corresponds to the level of a factor. So remember that here, the green lines corresponds to more uneven age management, and the blue lines to more even age management. So we can see that uneven age management caused 3 times more roads and more road costs than even age management. So this questions the ability of the forest industry to adapt to high level of uneven age management. In addition, the increased road network will result in higher access for humans, and it will change the way some species move in the landscape and hence their interaction and dispersal. So all of this can have many impacts on the long term. And so if we take a look at our results related to old forests, so now we're going to distinguish results for the north and the south of our area, as there are interesting differences. So we can see that the amount of old forest in the landscape was increased with uneven age management. This is because uneven age cuts always kept old trees cohorts in the pixels, and thus it seems that uneven age management can preserve at least more mature and complex forests in the landscape. Fragmentation-wise, we can see that uneven age management increased the fragmentation of the landscape by a large margin. Because uneven age management made 3 times more road, it's not very surprising. However, the clumpy fragmentation index does not inform us on how roads might impact different species in reality. The literature tells us that forest roads, they can be a barrier to movement for some species, but they can also enhance the movement of other species like wolves, for example. So to better understand the effects of these forest roads, we could take a look at functional connectivity, meaning connectivity from the point of view of a given species. And we can see that in the north of our study area, differences between management scenarios are lessened. The north of our area is composed of boreal forest, where forest fires burn 10 times more surface than in the south. So these forest fires, they reduce the amount of forest, and they also increase the fragmentation in spite of forest management, which reduces the difference between scenarios. So that's because fires, they create patches of younger forest, which takes the place of old forest, but it also fragments it. And these patches, of course, they can also be made by even age methods, which is why it makes the signal a bit harder to see. So therefore, it seems that when stand replacing disturbances are present, it becomes more difficult to differentiate the effects of different management strategies. So here I have to come back to the warning I made before. The fires in our simulation were too small, and if they were bigger, the differences between the southern and northern areas will certainly be reduced, as bigger fires means less fragmentation than a lot of small fires, as it happened here. So the northern area should look a bit more like the southern area when I update everything. So concerning aggregation, it had a small effect on reducing the fragmentation of the landscape, and almost no effect on the rest of our measures. Of course, we could have aggregated more since we only varied the historical average of aggregation by a factor of 2. However, aggregation is always limited by special constraints. So all in all, we don't expect that aggregation is capable of fully compensating the effects of a big shift toward the use of uneven age management on road density and fragmentation. So what do we take from all of this? So before concluding, there are 3 little things to consider regarding our results. First is that roads and patches of young forests both create fragmentation, but different fragmentation. They have different impacts that must be studied via the notion of functional connectivity. The second is that we are not sure if fragmentation per se, meaning fragmentation separated from habitat loss, is actually good or bad for ecosystems. And there's still debates ongoing in the literature about its effects on biodiversity, for example. So third is that our definition of old forest is arguable. There are many definitions related to their structure, their age, or biogeochemical processes. And had we focused on the difference between cut and uncut forests, we expect that uneven age management would have fared much worse in our results. So the take-home message here is that firstly, choosing between even age and uneven age management represents a trade-off between the quantity of roads in the landscape and the presence of more mature and complex forests. Secondly, it's important to remember that there are important interactions between stem replacing disturbances and the impacts of forest management. Because of this, the use of uneven age management should take into account natural disturbances. And thirdly, it seems that while it can be of some use, aggregating the cuts will not balance out the issue that a big increase in the use of uneven age management comes with much, much more roads. It could, however, balance out a smaller increase. So finally, as with most things, this is not a binary problem, with one management being the best option and the other the worst. Both have their advantages, and it's possible to mix the two strategically, spatially and temporally, like in the triad that Matthew told us about in his keynote speech. So this could certainly lead to an optimal trade-off between conservation and exploitation, resulting in landscapes where the amount of mature and complex forests is enhanced, while the quantity of roads is kept at a minimum. And that's it. So I thank you very much for taking a look at all of this. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. If you're interested in my research, you can take a look at my website. And you can also take a look at the wonderful research of my thesis director, Elise Philotas, and Christian Messier.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ajay Sharma, Assistant Professor at West Florida Research and Education Center, University of Florida. Well, Clement described differences between even-aged and uneven-aged systems, so that saves me some time. As you know, this uneven-aged silviculture, it's relatively more common in northern United States or in Canada. In the South, it is not. South is all about pine plantations. It's all about pine plantations, intensive pine plantations raised only for pulp. This is what we have done in the past 60, 70 years. All of our research efforts have been towards growing pine plantations faster for pulpwood, with almost no attention given to uneven-aged silviculture. So why that is the case? In the South, land managers, this is how they perceive uneven-aged silviculture. So it is a very strongly held belief that the pines are not suitable for, cannot be managed using uneven-aged silviculture because they are intolerant and they will not regenerate under their own canopy. Also, that even-aged systems are more productive than uneven-aged systems, and economically, uneven-aged silviculture does not work for southern pines. But they also agree that uneven-aged systems, they mimic natural disturbances. They are potentially more resilient and adaptive, and they provide more environmental services. So these notions are developed based on their ecological understanding, but not really on their on empirical research data or their experience. So, this motivated our research. We wanted to answer this question: can southern pines be managed using uneven-aged silviculture? And if yes, then how does it compare to the contemporary even-aged management for these systems? So three major species of southern pines are longleaf pine, slash pine, and loblolly pine. Since this is not much practiced in the South, not much research is conducted, there are only a few existing trials that you can find out in the Southeast examining uneven silviculture. So one is Crozet, Escambia, the Jones Center, Blackwater River, Gothi, Tetzel. So I'm involved in at least 4 of them, and they cover a variety of these species, southern pines on variety of site conditions, and some of them are replicated operational scale projects, and some are basically just demonstration trials. As an example, this is one experimental trial that I set up as a graduate student at Sault State Forest in Northern Florida. It's in slash pine, and it's a plantation conversion experiment. So how you convert plantation to an uneven stance using different kinds of reproduction harvests. It's a completely randomized block design experiment, replicated, and individual treatment plot is more than 6 hectares. So it's a truly operational scale experiment. Another experiment that I'm involved in is in Longleaf Pine, which is in southern Alabama. Very similar design, but in different species. And the other experiments have slightly different design, but broadly replicated and well. So the fundamental question, can southern pines be regenerated using uneven silviculture? Will they regenerate under their own canopy? The answer is resounding yes. This is slash pine 2-acre harvest gap, as you see in group selection. It regenerates very well. It regenerates in 1 acre, half acre. It regenerates in single tree selection harvest, both slash pine and longleaf pine, in different site conditions at different sites. So this regeneration is profuse. It's in several thousand seedlings per hectare that you find following a reproduction cut in next few years. And this regeneration in longleaf pine is also pretty resistant to different seasonal burns and different fire intensities. So we found that longleaf pine regeneration will survive in different conditions, except when it is summer burn and it is very, very intense. So that's when you need to take care if regeneration is a concern. But slash pine is a different story. It is not that fire resistant species. In slash pine group selection plots and other treatments, we actually found that about 94% of regeneration of new seedlings that regenerate following a reproduction cut, they are actually killed by fire. So only about 6% survive. No, that might sound catastrophic, but this 6.36% is actually equivalent to 725 stems per hectare, because the seedling density following reproduction cuts was more than 10,000 to 14,000 seedlings per hectare. So 725 per hectare, 6% survival should be okay. Well, we'll talk more about that. So how much regeneration is actually needed to sustain these systems, uneven systems? Well, long-term data will take several decades to come, but we can do some kind of modeling. So we used FVS model and simulated different regeneration densities with different cutting cycles over a 100-year period. And consistently, we found that if you can get 250 seedlings per hectare survive every cutting cycle in uneven systems, they should be sustainable. So even in the worst case scenario in the field, where you have 94% mortality following fire, you still have 750 seedlings per hectare, while you can sustain these systems with only 250 seedlings. So regeneration and fire works fine for uneven systems in southern pines. Well, we also use this simulation over 100-year period to figure out how these even and uneven systems should compare for different timber and ecosystem services. For timber production, yes, we do see that even systems produce more total merchantable timber. mostly the component is pulpwood. But for saw timber production, both even and uneven systems are comparable. About stand carbon, so this is a standing carbon. So for standing carbon, if you do not give a cut to a stand, of course it maintains more, but in uneven systems, the green line that you see, it maintains more consistent, similar amount of carbon over time, while uneven edge, the purple one, it fluctuates widely depending on when the clear cut is done, when it is in the most stocked phase, and when thinning is done. So there is some value in maintaining consistent standing carbon in a forest. Oops. How about structural diversity? So uneven silviculture is a lot about structural diversity. So green line here that represents uneven silviculture, uneven stands. So of course, structural diversity in uneven stands is extraordinarily high. Lot more than even stands. So it suggests that those ecosystem services that depend on structural diversity should be maximized in uneven edged stands and should be very poorly provided by even stands. Structural diversity is very less studied subject in southern pines. So we wanted to know how structural diversity is related to production. We used FIA data, more than 12,000 plots, to find out relationships for these major pine species in the forest, in the south. So we found as structural diversity increases, above ground biomass increases. And this relationship is actually stronger than species richness and above ground biomass relationships. So maybe structural diversity is a better measure of above ground biomass production than species richness. And species diversity and structural diversity are also highly correlated. So managing for structural diversity should serve diversity and production functions as well. It's highly suggested using FIA data. Beetle is increasingly a problem in the south, and we do not have much research conducted on how structure changes it. But this UF entomologist, Jerry Hulser, based on his work in Europe and some in the south, has produced a documentary. And he makes it a point again and again that to solve the beetle problem, southern pines should be managed using uneven silviculture, though empirical data still is lacking. There's another recently published paper that actually says that high structural diversity is not good for forest health, which again is based on FIA data. So it's a different viewpoint here, one. Hurricanes, that's another big issue in the south. So how is forest structure or even versus uneven stands related to hurricane resistance? Fortunately, we had this long-term data set available from Escambia experimental forest, where we could compare how resistance and resilience are related to structure. So if you look at here, this is the blue line, this represents stand if there were no projected stand if there were no hurricane, and red line is the damage by hurricane first and then recovery following hurricane over next several years. So the upward slope of red line should be a measure of resilience. It's the recovery in terms of basal area. So you will see that even a stand has some resilience, while BDQ, which is a stand regulation, stock regulation method in uneven systems, resilience is higher. Diameter limit cut now and VCGDL also has higher resilience. So there's a strong suggestion that uneven systems are more resilient to hurricane damage as well. Understory, these are very high species diverse ecosystems. Majority of the species diversity in the understory in southern pines. So this is a research by Dale Brockway and Outcat that showed that at two different sites, uneven silviculture was either equally good or superior to alternative managements for understory diversity also. It looks like fire plays a bigger role than structure in these ecosystems, at least in the early stages. Wood quality, not much research is done, but there's an old publication that shows that uneven stands are either equal or better in wood quality than plantations of nature. Then big thing, will it make money for me or not? What's the economic implications are? Well, it's a difficult question to answer. It depends on several factors. It depends on interest rates, cost of artificial regeneration, ecosystem services. Broadly, if interest rates are higher, cost of artificial regeneration is higher, and you are paid for ecosystem services, then uneven management is highly lucrative. Otherwise, it depends on other conditions. We also did comparison of loblolly, longleaf, and slash pine, how uneven silviculture would work in those. Loblolly can be most profitable, and there are specific cutting cycles and basal area ranges where it would become most profitable. So overall, can they be sustainably managed? Well, 10 to 15 years of data highly suggest that yes, they can be. They will regenerate successfully. Simulation modeling will show that over 100 years, they can be sustained with the given level of regeneration that you see, along with the interaction with fire. Data suggests they should be more resilient and resistant to hurricane damages. Their ecological theory will tell they should also be resistant to insect damages, though we don't have empirical data yet. Economically, they should prove superior in certain market conditions, and especially if ecosystem services are provided.
Today, I'm going to be talking about tree regeneration of key forest types in the Northwoods. And again, my name is Catherine Henry. I'm currently a postdoctoral scholar with the Nature Conservancy in Michigan, and I'm a recent graduate from the Forestry Department at Michigan State University. So just to give a little bit of backgrounds, because I know the Northwoods is not a term everyone's always familiar with. I'm referring to the Northwoods here as this 212 ecological section, which is seen in blue on the map. And I want to recognize that the Northwoods are the traditional and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe tribes, the Santee division of the Eastern Dakota group of the Ochiathai-Sakowin, or the Great Sioux Nation, and the Menominee Nation. So why this area? It's highly forested landscape. We saw in an earlier presentation about some of the great old growth resources that are in this region. And in this region, there's also a variety of biotic, abiotic, and human-mediated disturbances, which are challenging to manage and to conserve. So we've got things like, overabundant or higher abundance of white-tailed deer browsing, which is prohibiting regeneration, a variety of pests and pathogens which have come through and decreased the pool of viable species for the canopy. And then of course, management challenges and legacy of management and how that interacts with all these other factors. So also mentioned earlier in some of the talks, but a lot of this area, when the European colonists came through, and there was really intense logging in this region in the late 1800s to early 1900s, that means that a lot of these stands are currently maturing. And this kind of time period makes it increasingly important to understand what the understory looks like, what tree regeneration looks like, to understand what the future of these forests might be. And so that's been an area of focus for me, tree regeneration, and what I'm going to be talking about today. So kind of the overall guiding question for this research that I've been working on, that hopefully it's in preparation right now to be published sometime soon. But basically broadly asking how does tree species diversity vary for tree regeneration layer throughout the Northwoods and for dominant forest groups. And focusing on questions of species diversity to kind of try to capture what species we have and what species are important, and let that kind of guide management. So this is kind of broken down into two more specific questions. The first being an analysis of the factors that are predictive of tree regeneration species diversity. And the broad methods for this were comparing different candidate generalized linear models of species richness at the plot level. I'll get to the data in just a minute. And looking at them modeled by a variety of abiotic, biotic, and human-mediated factors. And the second kind of guiding question is how spatial and temporal species-specific trends can inform conservation and management efforts. And so this was done by looking at a spatially varying temporal model, looking at changes over time in the abundance of different regeneration species. I looked at the 10 most widespread, so the 10 most commonly occurring species per forest group currently, and looked at their changes over time, and allowing the trend over time to vary in terms of slope and intercept by the sub-ecoregion that the data was in. And now I'll get to that good data. So as others have mentioned, I've been making use of the U.S. Forest Service, or the Forest Service FIA data, the forest inventory and analysis data. So if you're not familiar with it, we have this, very widespread systematic data set with about 1 survey area per 6,000 acres. It's a little higher in Michigan, but that's kind of the minimum. And in our region, they're inventoried every 5 years. And I've been making great use of the RFIA package, which I just like to plug because it's really making the data of FIA much more easily accessible. Of course, you have to know R, but it really has made it way more accessible to me. And so when I'm talking about tree regeneration, for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to be talking about stems that are taller than 12 inches for hardwood species or taller than 6 inches for conifers, and that are less than 1 inch in diameter at breast height. And so this regeneration size class in FIA is measured at each of these sampling points in an area which totals 54 square meters. And I did filter out FIA data for plots that are 100% forested and a single forest type. And I looked at just the 6 most common forest types. And I also looked at plots that were inventoried and the 3 most recently completed cycles. And this means that there are plots that we have data on for the past 10 years at least, so we can assess whether or not they've been recently harvested. And on the right here, you can see I have over 3,000 plots after filtering for all of these different criteria, most common of which aspen birch and maple beech birch, but there are a few other forest types that I analyzed for this. So this is the data that I was using for both of those research questions. And then predictor data for that first question, things that are predicting species richness at the plot level. I included the number of regeneration stems that were counted in the plots, which is important to account for sampling effort, which influences how many species you will discover. And I also included stand origin, which was mostly for lowland conifer and the pine systems. There were some that were plantation origin. I did include them and included when appropriate origin as a predictor. And also forest type. So the 6 categories I showed earlier are a forest grouping, and they have sub-forest types within those groupings as the data are labeled as. And I did do quite a bit of analysis to ensure, what biases a group versus a forest type introducing. And the results were pretty consistent, and there's also a lot of heterogeneity in the distribution of forest types within a group. Like there's some that are really common and some that weren't. So I looked at it as a group, but then included forest type. And these are things that I kind of included in like the null model. They're all just kind of things that were base included in all the candidate models. And then I included things, abiotic factors, including the drainage index, which is a measure of the long-term soil wetness, and mean annual temperature and precipitation. For biotic, I looked at things like the estimated deer browsing impact, stand age, canopy diversity, which I approximated using the Shannon index, and also canopy basal area per acre. And then human-mediated factors included whether or not they were recently harvested within the last 3 cycles or 10 years, and the owner group who owns these stands. And so I will just dig into the results now. So this is a plot of tree regeneration species richness plotted as a function of abundance. So this is essentially a species accumulation curve looking at all the plots together. And you can kind of see the top line is green. It's the oak hickory tended to have the higher species richness per plot. Whereas lowland conifer had typically a significantly lower species richness than the other groups. And then all the other 4 were kind of in the middle, which was interesting to me that, pines and maple beech birch, that's MBB, abbreviated there, all kind of had similar species diversity. And this was something I was just interested to visualize to kind of wrap my head around what the regeneration diversity looked like among these different forest groups. And getting into that research question 1, associations between tree regeneration and potential drivers. So unsurprisingly, across all forest types, species richness was associated with the number of stems, the abundance of stems that were counted. They were also all positively associated with the canopy Shannon index, so canopy diversity. So it seems like what you have currently in the overstory is really important in predicting what is coming up through the understory, and that was across all forest types. There's a lot of, including 6 forest groups, there was a lot of different findings, and so I'm just going to highlight a couple of the more interesting ones. We found that northern hardwood stands that had a lower basal area tended to have greater species richness. This was interesting to me. My background is working in northern hardwood managed stands, and knowing that we have issues with low density of sugar maple in Michigan for managed northern hardwood stands, especially in stands with higher basal areas. It was interesting that it kind of paralleled, these challenges with regeneration, that we also had this parallel challenge with having fewer species present in stands with higher basal area. And then we also found pines, lowland conifer, maple beech birch, and aspen birch stands, all stands that have had a recent harvest. So within the past 10 years, in the model, they had higher species richness. So it seems that this pulse of, diversification, heterogeneity that these harvests are presumably providing is enabling a wider range of species to be present in the understory in the regeneration layer. Interesting, there was no associations with deer use, and just one significant association with site quality. So they, at least in this model, weren't, thanks Trevor, weren't super predictive, but we know, of course, that deer use and site quality have a huge influence on these systems and on the regeneration, but nothing significant came out with in terms of species richness. And this is coming from that second question. I looked at the trends over time again for those top 10 species. And something that emerged over time is that a lot of the namesake species have been declining throughout the region over time. On the right here is a graph for maple beech birch, and I sorted it according to the estimate of how it's changed over time. I wouldn't pay attention a lot to the actual value because it's still on the log scale, but the trend to take away is that you see the species up at the top tended to decline over time over the past 15, 20 years of FIA data, and that includes sugar maple. And then the species all the way on the bottom, serviceberry species, that has been increasing over time. And I found that serviceberry really significantly increased in quite a few different forest groups over time. So there's, results similar to these, and there's also maps that we can look at. I won't for the sake of time, but this analysis was really interesting. It kind of backed up a lot of trends that we see with thinking that there aren't enough species of, enough stems of a given species. And you can actually see that this isn't, this is something that's been happening over time. So it just kind of builds up what we've been seeing in the literature. So overall, just the take-home points were that there was a variety of abiotic, biotic, and human-mediated factors which are influencing tree regeneration. And these species-specific temporal and spatial trends can really help inform management decisions, especially, identifying regions where there's maybe fewer species that would benefit from underplanting or assisted migration efforts. I'm still trying to chew on how to take these data, which is kind of a smaller area, and build that up to the stand scale. So that's something I'm really interested in thinking more about. And I am hoping to take these results and make an R-Shiny application development. So if anyone has any ideas of things, I'd really like this to be something that practitioners, people who own their own forests, foresters, can look at and really interact with this FIA data in a way that summarizes meaningful trends of regeneration spatially over time that would be useful. So this is just a screen grab from a beta version I've been working with. It's just showing regeneration trees per acre for northern hardwoods for sugar maple over time. But so it's a really neat interactive, if you haven't heard of it before, it's just a way for people who know how to use R to make web applications. So that's also something that I'm hoping to come out with the paper. And thank you all for listening. I'm not sure that we have time for questions, but I'm happy to connect with anyone I'm on LinkedIn and ResearchGate.
Oh, hello everyone, my name is Léa Darquier. I'm a PhD student under the supervision of Professor Annie Desrochers at the University of Quebec in Abitibi-Témiscamingue. So today I'm going to talk about my first chapter, the first chapter of my thesis. So to begin with, when I speak about my project, I usually go as far as I study the effects of manual release, and then I lose half my public. So I'm going to start my presentation by explaining what is manual release and why and when do we need it, especially when talking about spruce aspen mixture, which is the mixture I work with. So first of all, manual release is more often than not used in mixed stands. So the law in Quebec states that if we cut a mixed stand, it must be regenerated into a mixed stand afterwards. And when a spruce aspen mixed stand is harvested, the aspen regrow easily, unlike the spruce, which is well known. And so the post-harvest treatment starts when site with seed preparation and by replanting black spruce. Unfortunately, the competition is very often too much for the planted seedlings, and that's when a manual or mechanical release is needed. The goal of this kind of treatment is to remove all competition from the spruce seedling and give them a better access to light at the seedling stage. So the intended scenario for the release is the following. We cut the aspen and other competition, the spruce can grow peacefully and everyone is happy. Well, if that was true, I wouldn't be there presenting my project. Instead of being controlled, the aspen are fully back the year after the release and the spruce seedlings are once more overwhelmed. And this means that we need to come back regularly to cut the aspens, which is an economic and environmental issue. Economic because we have to pay the workers who will come more often, and environmental because we need to travel to the stands and it takes a lot of gas to do a release. But why doesn't it work? It is because aspens can regenerate via suckering. So this strategy allows an individual whose main stem has been cut off to regrow rapidly by its roots to compensate for its loss. Normally, the main stem sends a pheromone called auxin into the roots, which will inhibit this suckering. So this mechanism is called apical dominance. So cutting all the aspen stems during the release means that this apical dominance doesn't exist anymore, and then so the regeneration of the aspens can restart. And so the main question of this project is based on this possible self-regulation that interests us, and it wouldn't leaving the aspen stems, especially the largest one, naturally limit the suckering and thus reduce the number of intervention. So, to test our hypothesis, we created a new release modality called reverse diameter limit, or RDL. I'm going to say RDL, it's easier for me to pronounce, and compared it to two traditional release and a control. So first of all, we have the systematic release, where all stems are cut at stump height except for the softwood. The second traditional release is the crop-free one, where release is only done around each softwood stem in a radius of 60 to 90 centimeters, and the rest is kept untouched. Our new RDL treatment is similar to the systematic, except that 20% of the biggest aspen stems are kept on site with the softwood stems. And finally, we have the control when nothing was cut. So my study site is located in the Témiscamingue area in Quebec, near the Ontario border, and consists of 3 replicas of 4 hectares each. So each replica was divided into 4 experimental units of 1 hectare each, and the treatment was randomly assigned to each unit. 4 workers were used, and each worker released a different treatment in each block to limit the human bias. So as I say, I'm going to present you the result of my first chapter, which main objective is to study the effect of manual release on aspen regeneration. So I have 2 main hypotheses. So H1, where leaving the biggest aspen stems will reduce the number of suckers compared to cutting them all down. And the second one is about the growth. So total volume of aspens will be the highest when the biggest stems are left. And a contrario, the volume will be the lowest when all aspens are cut down. So my results. So this first graph shows the aspen density in relation to each treatment. And inside each treatment, we have like new, so the post-release suckers, and remnant, so the stems that were left during the release. And both were separated into this graph. So what it mainly shows us is that the density in the systematic treatment, so the far right, is almost twice the density of aspens in the RDL treatment, so the one just left, the systematic. And the next graph is the same, but with the total density instead. So first of all, I want you to show that between the control and the systematic, so nothing was cut and everything was cut, there is no differences. So meaning that everything regrew 1 year after the release, which yay for my research. So the systematic treatment still has a higher total density than the RDL treatments, despite the fact that there are no remnants in the systematic treatments. Which means I can, yay for me, my first hypothesis is validated. So let's see my second hypothesis, which is the volume. So I looked at the volume per stem and then at the volume per hectare. So for the volume per stem, RDL has a volume 8 times bigger than the control. So we kept the bigger ones and they have less competition than the control. So it's a logical result. And there are no difference between the news. When we look at the total volume per stem, we see that the RDL treatment has a much bigger volume than all the other treatments, especially the systematics one, which is 17 times smaller. So as well for my first part of my second hypothesis, I can validate it. So now with the volume per hectare, it differs from the volume per stem by adding the mortality in the calculus. And due to the large number of suckers that have regrown, the volume in the systematic treatment is greater than in the other treatment, especially the control. The volume of suckers in the RDL treatments is similar so that in the control, because although there are fewer suckers, they are larger. So the two parameters compensate each other. And when we look at the total volume, we can see that the RDL treatment has a volume per hectare 12 times higher than the systematic treatments, but it's similar to the control. So for the third part, yay me, I can validate my hypothesis. I'm sure everyone is very happy that I could validate all my hypotheses, but what does it really mean? As I explained in the introduction, the release serves to increase the amount of light reaching the spruce trees. When we look at this percentage in relation to the treatment, we can see that the light in the RDL treatment is slightly lower than in the systematic treatment. So while we left the biggest aspens on site, the competition for light remains relatively similar to the systematic treatments, where the stems are smaller but more numerous. As you can see in the following graphs, when we compare the density and the volume per stem, we can see that the aspens in the RDL treatment are less numerous but bigger than in the systematic treatment. So what we expect is to have in the future a more important apical dominance applied by the remaining aspens compared to the systematic treatments. So this means that the structure appearing after the release should be controlled more quickly in the years to come. And I am returning to, in the field this year to test this hypothesis. So my last slide. So this project can resolve the economic and environmental issue that is the traditional release right now by reducing the number of visits needed to lead the regenerating stand into a mixed stand. So it will also give us more short-term data about manual release, be it new or traditional. And finally, to go further than my thesis, it would be really interesting to study the effect of the RDL treatment after several more years, and also integrate a similar kind of modality in the cleaning and pre-commercial thinning treatments. And I'm done. Thanks for your attention.